Hi, I'm Iain and welcome back to the Northland Workshop, except that we're not in the workshop. This is actually the first of a series of videos that I'm going to do in this old shed of mine with basic tools in just a corner of it, doing woodworking projects for beginners. Because the other day somebody said that they'd like to get started woodworking, but they don't have a complete shop. Well, I'm here to show you that you don't need a complete shop or even a shop at all in order to do some small woodworking projects. It's impossible to do good work with dull tools. So the very first thing we need to do in the woodshed is get a system to sharpen our cutting tools. In this case, I've gone with a combination India oil stone. And what that means is this uses aluminum oxide grit glued together, and it's a combination stone. So there's a coarse side and there's a fine side. Today we're going to build the box that this lives in. This does two things. It allows us to clamp it in place so that way it doesn't scoot around while we're trying to sharpen with it. And I made it the right size so that way I could glue this leather strop on the top to get the final polish on the cutting edge. Because the finer an edge you can get, the easier the tools are going to cut, and the better the cut's going to be. So here, essentially, we have three different stages. We have the coarse stage, the intermediate stage, and then finally the mirror finish stage. For this little oil stone box, I've chosen these two scrap pieces of 2x10 because they're thick enough to be the top and the bottom of the box. They were free enough, and even though they have some scars from a hole saw and they have a severe cup, I'm not too worried about that because we're going to plane the cup out of it, and I'll just position these to be on the bottom. And really, it's an oil stone box. The thing's going to get grimy with years of oil and sharpening debris, so I'm not too worried about the wood as long as it does the job. So we're going to need to rip these down and cut them to length. First we need to decide what do we rip them to. Because the leather is the widest thing, this is going to dictate the width of the box, and I want the box to be a little bit wider than that, and for right now I want to cut it oversized from that. So if I measured this, it's exactly 3 inches. So I'm going to rip the box to be 3.5. That'll give me plenty of room to true up the edges, plane it flush, and I think it'll just work out a little bit better. So it needs to be 3.5 inches wide, and then the stone is just a little bit over 8 inches long. It looks like it's about 8 1/8. This is exactly 8 inches long. I'm going to go 10 inches on the length. That way there's an inch on either end to hold the sharpening stone into position. I've gone ahead and set the marking gauge to 3.5 inches, and I'm now going ahead and marking where the cut's going to be on the piece of wood. Once I have that done, before I move the setting, I'm going to go ahead and make the same mark on this other piece. There. With this pin style, you want to be careful that it doesn't dig into the grain and follow it one way or the other. So it's better to take a couple light passes with it than one really deep pass that digs in and goes off course. Now I want to come in and put the blade of the combination square right up to that line that I just scribed with the marking gauge, and draw a line down the edge at 90 degrees. This is going to help me to start the rip cut perpendicular to the edge. I'm ready to make the first rip cut of the project, so I figured we'd talk about ripping real quick. Ripping is cutting along the grain. Cross-cutting is just what it sounds like, cutting across the grain. They do have two different teeth configurations for the saw, but really at this point the best thing to do is just get a sharp saw no matter which tooth configuration it is, and it's going to be light years ahead of some really dull kitchen knife of a saw. The other thing to be aware of is I'm holding this in the workmate with the plastic bench dogs, so that way the cut line is over the opening, so I'm free to make the cut without hitting any of the metal framework or the work surface itself. There is a slight issue in that because it's being clamped by squeezing it in from the sides, this cut is going to try and pinch closed as I work towards the end. So I'm probably going to have to change and hold it in a different way, but we'll get to that when the time comes. I'm going to go as far as I can in this orientation because it's just a little bit easier. So I've got my saw, I've got this thing clamped in place so it's not going to scoot around. Final thing I want to do is take my can of oily rag. It's just an oily rag rolled up in a can with some 30 weight motor oil on it, but any kind of super cheap machine oil will work. And I'm just going to oil the plate of the saw. What that's going to do is make it glide just a little bit easier through the cut. I want to take my thumb and put it up against the edge of the saw plate and pull the saw plate backwards a few times to make a starting notch. You want to go lightly with it so it doesn't dance all around and ruin the edge of the workpiece. I'm also cutting on the waste side. That's the side I want to keep, so the line is going to remain on that side. I keep the saw on this side of the line. Now I can go ahead and start cutting, and at this point I want to watch two things. I want to watch that I'm following this line. I also want to watch that I'm following that lane so it stays square. So what I'm going to do is start tipping the saw vertically, cut down, now I've established the 90-degree cut that way. It will try and track that way as long as I don't twist it severely one way or the other. Now I can go ahead and turn my attention to this line. So I'll track this line. The saw will now naturally track 90 degrees up and down. Now what I'm going to do is stand on this front step. That'll do two things. It'll help weigh the workmate down so it doesn't scoot around. It also brings that to a better height for me to saw. Now I can make more use of this saw because it's down near my kneecap. And right there it's starting to pinch. So what I'll do is unclamp it, move the bench dogs out of the way, and scoot these jaws together a little bit. That'll give me more support, and I'll just hold these as I finish the cut. There's one, now I'll do the other. Now I want to cut these to rough length. First what I want to do is check to see if either one of these ends is overly square. This one's pretty good, but this one is even better. So this is going to be the reference, and it really doesn't matter if it's a degree off because it's going to get planed down anyways, but the closer I can get it, the better. I want this thing to be 10 inches when it's done, so I'm going to go ahead and mark it 10 1/16. That'll give me just a little bit of room to play and plane everything down flush once we're done. Now I want to take the combination square and butt it up against the factory edge, because the factory edge, any issues it has is minor compared to the rough cut I just made with the handsaw. So I can go ahead and mark that. Now I want to go ahead and mark a perpendicular line to the cut, because again I'm going to use that starting out to guide the saw straight up and down, because I want to make this cut as accurately as possible. Now I'm going to go ahead and clamp this in the workmate. I'm resting it on this metal cross member just to give it a little extra support. Now I'm just going to use this piece to mark the length for the other half of the box. I've set my combination square to 3/4 of an inch, and I'm using it to line up the edge of the oil stone 3/4 of an inch away from the edge of the piece of wood. With that held in place, I'm going to use my pencil to mark either side of the oil stone. Now I just need to adjust it side to side, but before I do that and before I adjust this, I want to go ahead and do the same thing to the top of the box. I've clamped the bottom of the box in the workmate over one of the supports. The reason for that is this is the most rigid area of the workmate, so as I start chopping with the chisel, it's got the least amount of bounce to it. If I was to do it in the center of the work surface, there's a lot of bounce, but over here it's well supported. Same goes for a standard workbench. Whenever you're trying to chop something out with a chisel and you're really having to hammer down on it, you want to do that over the leg of the bench, not over the center of the bench. For this, I'm just going to use my 1-inch chisel, and I want to place it on the pencil line, and once it's on the pencil line, just tap it with the mallet. That's all I want to do at this point. Move it over a little bit, tap it again. Move it over to the corner, tap it again. I don't want to wail on it too much, because if I do, the bevel will actually force the chisel back and it'll make this opening bigger than I want it to be. So this is the delicate part right here. Just work my way along, overlapping where the chisel is. Now I want to go ahead and angle the chisel in towards that first cut and tap it. What this will do is remove a little piece of wood and give me a more defined edge to this cut. I could chop this whole recess out with nothing but the chisel and the mallet, but I really don't want to, because for one thing, that's going to be a lot of work. The other thing is it's not going to give me a super consistent depth. So to remove the bulk of the material, I have a 1-inch auger bit in my bit brace, and this weird contraption on the end is actually a depth stop for auger bits. These little feet right here will stop at a certain depth and I won't be able to drill any farther. So what I did is I set the distance between the cutting edge of the auger bit and the foot to be slightly less than the final depth of this mortise, so that way this will remove the bulk of the material and I'll be able to clean it up with the chisel and the router plane afterwards. So at this point, all I have to do is figure out where best to start and just drill a whole series of holes, removing the waste. Okay, with the bulk of the material removed, I can go ahead and start cleaning it up with the chisel. I've spent some quality time cleaning out the edges and the parts of the mortise that the auger bit couldn't get, and I've gotten it to a point that I'm happy with the fit. It's a snug fit, it doesn't rattle around in there, but it also doesn't hang up going in and out, so that way I can take it out, flip it over, and put it back in. That's where the happiness ends. It's not quite deep enough, and it's not nearly flat enough. It's very uneven down here, and like I said, it's just not deep enough, and that was done intentionally because the auger bit with the stop, as good as it is, doesn't leave a great finish, and I want something a little bit better to support the stone. I could continue on with my 1-inch chisel with the bevel down and simply keep paring away at this wood until I get it to the level I want. I might have to come in here with the mallet and chop down like I'm going through the whole drill of mortising, or there's another tool I could use. And that tool is what's known as a router plane. And this is one model of router plane. The way it works is there's a cutter, which you can think of this as a 1/2-inch wide chisel that has a depth stop to it. This base plate is the depth stop. It limits how deep this thing can cut, and I have an adjustment here to adjust the depth of cut, and then a locking mechanism to keep the cutter from digging down all on its own. What I want to do is kind of move this thing around until I find the highest spot in here, which is right here, and I'm just touching it. So what I do is I lift it up, I unlock that thumb screw, and then I give it between 1/4 and 1/2 a turn, and then I lock it back down. You want to make sure to lock it back down because, like I said, it'll adjust the depth all on its own otherwise. Now what I do is simply push it along, and that blade hanging down cleans off any of the high spots, and I can get into the corners. If I angle it a little bit, I can run it along the edges, clean those up. Once I clean up all the high spots that I can find, I turn it around, move it the other way, make sure to get into all the corners. Once that's done, I go ahead, unlock it, give it another 1/4 turn, lock it down again, and continue. The router plane is a finesse tool. It's not made for hogging out loads and loads of material, and you don't want to jam it in there. It's a finesse thing. You want to go easy on the router plane. So now what I'll do is continue this process until I get it to the depth I want, and then we'll come back and do the next step. After some quality time with the router plane, the oilstone now fits nicely in the base of the oilstone box, and the top fits nicely on the oilstone box. Before I clamp this all together and true up the edges, I want to fix one thing. It's rocking from this corner to this corner, which means these two corners are too high, and therefore these two are too low. These are what's hitting on the bottom of the box first. So I want to flip it over, and I'm just going to circle that corner and that corner right now to know these are the ones I need to work on. If I move this half of the box out of the way, and I clamp the top part in, now I can go ahead and with my 5 1/4 junior jack plane, I can start smoothing it down. I want to spend extra time on these edges. Now if you look, it's tearing out, which is telling me the grain is going in this direction. So it's going to be a little tricky, but I think I might be able to pull the plane towards me for this corner. I'll take a couple passes there, and a couple passes here. Let's see if we got the rock out of it. Yes, that seems pretty good. Now we can go ahead and true up the edges. Now that I know the top doesn't rock on the bottom of the box anymore, I can turn my attention to the edges. The first thing I did is I used my junior jack plane to plane down the saw marks until I now have smooth wood. It's got a couple cracks in the edge, but other than that, it's a smooth edge and it's straight. However, it's not square to this, and I'm treating the part of the box that has the opening that I now have flat and rock free compared to the top half as the reference face. That means I'm going to put the heel of the square on there, and as you can see, there's daylight over here and it's touching over here. So this edge is too high. I don't want to mess with the plane and try and tip it this way or try to adjust the blade so it cuts more on this side. All I want to do is just move the whole plane over this way, and it'll naturally tend to rock a little bit as I plane it. Now I'll go ahead and check it for square. That looks really good. Now I can go ahead and put both freshly planed edges together once I put the stone back in. That's the alignment key that keeps everything where it needs to be. And as you can see, these two edges don't line up completely. So I can fix that. All I need to do is plane this one down to mate this one. When I get it close, I'll take them apart, double check to make sure this is still square. I know this is square to this inside. I know this is squared to this inside. I just want to make sure I don't mess it up in the process of flushing it up. Now with those two edges still held together, I can tip it over this way and plane down these edges. And these edges, I don't have saw marks to remove, but I do have nicks and dents and these two roundovers that need to go away. Now I need to plane the ends flush, and to do that, I've got them as low in the vise as I can put them, and I'm going to cut in towards the middle. That way it's supported, so hopefully it reduces the chance of tear out. You'll also notice that I'm pushing it in at a very steep cut because all these growth rings are much harder than the wood in between, so the knife keeps jumping on it. So by getting a slicing cut, I get a cleaner cut and it's a little easier to push. I'm almost ready to glue the leather on the top, but before I do that, I want to take a second and chamfer all these edges, starting with the end grain. And all I'm going to do is hold it and simply plane at an angle. That looks about right. Really all I'm trying to do is get rid of the razor sharp edges that it has right now. Now it's time to glue the leather strop to the top of the oil box, and you can decide whether you want the smooth side up or the smooth side down. Personally, I prefer the rough side to be up, so that's how I'm going to do it here, but it's totally personal preference. Wood glue actually works really well at gluing leather down. The big thing is I want to make sure I have an even coat under the whole piece of leather. Now I'm going to take the bottom of the box, put it back to back like that, and use that as a clamping caul to distribute the pressure, so that way the leather gets clamped down nice and evenly. I'm ready to apply the finish for the oil stone box, and I want to give it a finish to help protect it so that way the oil doesn't soak into the wood quite as quickly, and also so it doesn't get real grimy looking right off the bat. So to do that, I took some 220 grit sandpaper and sanded everything down. Now I want to help seal the wood before I apply this dark walnut stain to it, because if I just apply the stain to the bare wood, the end grain's going to soak it in much faster than other parts. There's also some change in grain in here, and that will all make it look blotchy. You can use pre-stain conditioner, which is a special product that you brush on before you apply the stain, and that helps even out the blotchiness. You can also use a really weak coat of shellac. Well, in this jar I happen to have the denatured alcohol that I use for cleaning my brush after I shellac things. So over time this thing has become more and more shellac, so it's a very, very weak solution of shellac, and I'm actually going to use that to seal this wood. All I'm going to do is brush it on, wait for this to dry, and then we can start staining the workpiece. The key here is just flood it on the surface, let the wood soak it up. To apply the stain, I folded up a shop towel and I'm simply wiping it on. If there's a spot that I want to be darker, I'll simply go back and put another coat of stain. At this point, I'm brushing on the first of 2 coats of shellac that will really help to protect this box. The box is all set now, and we can go ahead and sharpen something. And I noticed that this plane blade was starting to get a little dull while I was using it, so let's go ahead and sharpen it. So what I want to do is loosen up the screw that holds the chip breaker on, swing the chip breaker out of the way so it doesn't damage the cutting edge, and now I have the plane iron. This little box is going to scoot all around. In the old days, they would actually take some finish nails and drive them into the bottom and clip them off so they were just barely protruding. Then those nails would dig into the workbench top and keep it from scooting. I don't really want to chew up the top of my workmate, so I'm going to use the little plastic dogs to simply clamp it in place. And that will be more than enough to keep it from scooting around. Now I'll take the top off the box, set it aside for a second, and we have the coarse side of the stone. This is an oil stone, so I'm going to use a little bit of 3-in-1 oil. It comes preloaded with oil, so you don't have to totally saturate the thing. Just give it a good coating. The purpose of the oil is to keep the metal that comes off the blade from embedding in the stone, which would limit the cutting action. Now I'm just going to sharpen this freehand, and people tend to freak out over that. It's not that hard. I start with the plane blade really low, and I bring it up. And with a little bit of practice, I can feel right when that bevel contacts the stone. Now I want to go ahead and lift it up just a couple more degrees. And with firm pressure, I'm going to go back and forth several times. Now there's no definite number of times that I need to go back and forth. I go back and forth until I feel a wire burr on the edge. Sometimes you can see the burr, sometimes you can't, but you'll be able to feel it. Okay, I feel a slight burr all the way along. What I like to do is to put a very, very subtle camber on this blade so that way the edges don't dig in. So what I'm going to do is try my best to keep that same angle, just apply more pressure on this corner. Take a couple passes. Now I'm going to do the same thing, but this time putting all my pressure on this corner. And what that does is it removes just a little bit more material on these corners than in the middle, so they just flare out ever so slightly. Now what I want to do is remove the burr that's on the back. So I'm going to put it face down and simply push and pull a couple times and check to see if that burr has disappeared. And it has. Now I want to take a rag and wipe off the plane blade. The reason for this is some of the aluminum oxide abrasive on this stone has come off. That's what it's supposed to do, so it's exposing fresh grit. However, that grit gets stuck to the oil on the blade. I don't want to bring that grit around to the other side, so I want to clean that off first. I'm also going to wipe off the stone. That does two things. Gets rid of the bulk of the oil, and as you can see, it has dark gray metal in it. That's from the plane blade. Now I flip it over to the fine side. Go ahead and put some oil on it. And I'm going to repeat this process. So I find the bevel right there, lift up a couple degrees, and I'm trying to use as much of this stone as possible so it wears evenly. And already I can start to see the oil turning gray. That's the metal filings. Now I'm going to put all my pressure on this side, put all my pressure on this side, and let's see. Got a burr there, burr there, burr there. Yep, I've got a burr all the way along. I need to remove that burr. Once again, flip it over, couple strokes. Still there, so I will, couple more strokes. That's perfect right there. Now I've moved that burr back to this side. So at this point, I'm going to find that bevel again, take just a couple light strokes. It's good. Perfect. No burr there, no burr here. Sometimes you have to work that burr back and forth a couple times before it breaks off. Sometimes you'll even see it on here as just a really fine little steel wire, but I don't see it this time. And again, just wipe off the excess oil and close up the sharpening box. Now for the strop. This piece of leather came with some of this gray buffing compound, which the manufacturer tells me is the same as the green buffing compound in terms of coarseness. So I'm taking them at their word for that. I want to load this thing up really well, and because it's brand new leather strop, it's going to use quite a bit of buffing compound to load it. After this, it just takes a little bit of extra buffing compound each time, and it's good to go. So, to use the strop, what I don't want to do is push this thing forward, because it's just going to dig right into the leather, and then I'm going to have to peel it off and put another piece on. So the only way I go is to pull. And what I do is start at the end, find the bevel, pull back. Find the bevel, pull back. And the more you do it, the more you get used to it. I'm also alternating the pressure from side to side again to make sure I'm working that ever so slight camber that I put in the thing. I want to go between 20 and 30 times. Sometimes I do as much as 50 just because I get in the zone. And if we look, it's a super polished edge, and that's what we want. Each time we go to a finer grit, we're trying to reduce the size of the scratches. However, as a downside, that raised another burr. So now I want to strop the back. The way I do that is simply go back and forth. Again, you never want to push the cutting edge on the strop because you won't have a strop anymore. But if I pull a couple times, that moved the burr over here, a couple times here, and I don't feel a burr on either side. So now I take the rag one more time, wipe off any of the buffing compound that's left behind, and just like that, I have a razor sharp plane iron. And I can go ahead and sharpen all my tools just like that with this one little box. When I'm done with it, I'm just going to set it on the shelf for next time.